resist you. For those of you who have followed the career of Julian Fellows, or you appreciate his work, he's a television producer out of England. Much of his work addresses the subject of greed, particularly from the 19th and 20th century perspective. Because he's British, the nature of his focus is on England, sometimes the United States, in a time period surrounding the Industrial Revolution. And if you know anything about the Industrial Revolution, capitalism is kind of coming to the fore with all of its excesses and problems, something that really culminated in the crash of the stock market in 1929. But the capitalism with all of its excesses and problems is kind of his focus. And people are, especially here in the United States, making money quickly and sometimes losing it as quickly as they're making it. And there's all sorts of ramifications of that. When thinking about this time period, it really makes me wonder if slavery was really our greatest national sin. And it's a terrible sin for sure. But there is something that we should say about greed. Is our greatest sin possibly the sin of mismanaged wealth? What should we say to people who claim to live in a Christian nation, but at least on the subject of money, live like pagans? According to Forbes magazine, some of this is going to shock you. As of 2023, there were some 735 billionaires in the United States. But they stand on the shoulders of 22 million millionaires. There are only 69 million millionaires in the world. 22 million of them live here in this country. That's about a third. In fact, some statistics said it's as high as 40% of the millionaires live here. So if you think about this, there are only 335 million people in the United States. 22 million of them are millionaires. That's about what, 8%? Something like that? I'm not sure of the math. I didn't even bother. I just took a wild guess. I guess it's possible then, if it's around 8%, 7 to 8%, then you figure there's some millionaires in our church. It's possible. I don't really know. I've never really thought about it, but it's possible there may be millionaires in our church, maybe even more than the 8% proportional to our population. Flip it entirely around. In 2022, of the 400 richest people together, they were worth $4 trillion. That's just 400 people. And if I bring it closer to home, in our own zip code, this is from 2021, the typical home value is $474,000. That's why some of you bought elsewhere, right? It's expensive to live here. That's 105% above the typical home value in North Carolina. The median household income is $154,000 just in 27519. That's above Apex, the rest of Cary, and about 50% greater than all of Wake County put together. The average income, now that was median income, and the average income is $181,000. And if you think about this, 33% of the people who live in this zip code make more than $200,000 a year. 33% of the people in this zip code are in the top 10% of the nation's wage earners by household income. And this one was especially funny to me. Did you know that as of about 2019, this is an old statistic, the median rather, I shouldn't say typical, the median pastor salary for Morrisville was $150,000. So I like to tell people, I'm dragging that number down. I got my hands around it and I'm saying, we're bringing it down, bringing it down. That's crazy. That's crazy. At least it seems that way to me. Especially when you put this within a global context, where a mere $4,500 a year, $4,500 a year globally puts you in the top 50% of people living in the world. Some of you made that last week. It's possible. They make it in a year. If you have assets worth $94,000, then you're in the top 10% of people in the world globally. And I'll say it this way, if you own your own home, that is, you're making mortgage payments of any kind, and it's at least 5 years in, it's likely that you're in that top 10% globally. And it gets worse when you think about poverty, because in 2023, the average personal income was about $10,000 a year. The household income was $12,000 a year, but the median number is worse, only $3,000. So when you average everything, it gets better, but when you actually look at the middle number, it's about $3,000 on a global scale. And if you think about this, folks, that's the middle number. You take that means 50% of the people living on this planet make less than $3,000 a year. That's half of what, 8 billion people? 4 billion people are making under $3,000 a year. And then I started saying, well, where do the poorest people in the world live? Do you know most of them are in Africa? And if you think about this, in Somalia, for example, the average income is $430 a year. In Burundi, it's about $220 a year. That's the lowest number I found. And every time I've been overseas, when I've been out far east, I've seen poverty on a scale that I don't understand as an American. It's just not something we see here. Do you realize the people we help, the people who are part of the rescue mission, the people who are involved in our helping poor people, they're over the rich threshold? The poorest Americans globally are still the richest people on the planet. Now that leads me then to this idea, because when you look at James' letter, he now takes and stops what he's just made this comment about people going into business and not thinking about God. And now he's going to take some time and he's going to specifically address people who are wealthy. And so I think it's good for all of us to stop and recognize that we fit into that category. All of us do. Some are more wealthy than others in here in our church, but all of us fit into this category in some way. We're all wealthy people when you think about the global situation. Most of us are in the top 10%. Maybe some of you are in the top 1% globally. And so when you think about that, here's the lesson I think we need to start with, or the idea we start with, which is this. America, your money will not save you. Because I've lived now 54 years. I've just kind of gotten used to the idea that America is what it is and it always will be what it is, but that's just not true. Historically speaking, that would be a foolish position to take. Rome didn't last forever. All the great kingdoms of the earth have fallen. And this great kingdom will fall. It will eventually, some point. I hope it's not tomorrow. I hope it's a long time from now, but it will fall eventually. And money will not be our salvation because, James writes, judgment day is coming. He says in verse 1, all right, all of you rich men, weep and howl, for the miseries come upon you. Now he's addressing the rich. And if you remember, I've kind of placed within the book of James, there's a category of people called the rich, proud, foolish. And James is kind of comparing them to the poor and humble wise. And you'll remember I was telling you some weeks back, as I was teaching this to some very poor people in India, I was teaching this passage. We were walking through James together, and I said to him, how many of you want to be wise? I don't want to be foolish, I want to be wise. That's great. A bunch of hands went up, everybody wants to be wise. How many of you want to be humble? Every hand went up. How many of you want to be poor? Surprisingly, nobody picked poverty. So I want to be the rich, humble, wise. But that's not the categories that James is kind of putting here. And I think that's true for us because honestly, if you think about this in your own heart, how many of you are saying, I'd pick poverty over wealth? I don't think anybody would do that. Certainly Adam Smith, made his name on the invisible hand. It works in its own self-interest, if you know anything about capitalism. So the idea here then is this category of rich, proud, foolish. He's addressing these people, and he's addressed them in chapter 1 saying your life is temporary. And in chapter 2, he said, you've oppressed the poor people. Now in chapter 5, he's saying misery is coming upon you. And he says, you're not special. You go back to chapter 2, this guy who walks in with the really nice clothing, he says, you're not special in terms of how God thinks about you. And again, later in chapter 2, he says, you see a person who's needy, physically needy, and you're not helping him, you have no faith. And so these two stories in chapter 2 are both laid out for us so that we understand that there's nothing really special about wealthy people in God's eyes. And there have been some really great people of God that had money. Abraham comes to mind. King David, Solomon was the richest of all men. He may have been the richest man who ever lived. And yet, he's not singled out because of his wealth. You don't say, well, he was such a great man because of it. In fact, what James is doing here is he's saying to these people, you need to stop and just think about your life. James has already addressed these people in these previous sections, and he's saying, especially in chapter 4, you're looking about building wealth without considering God's will at all. These people are only interested in making money. They are not godly businessmen. And so I would say they are greedy. They are foolish. They are arrogant. And they want to be wealthy. And I guess because of that, God says, you're foolish. Now to those of you, he writes, who have abundant possessions. He says, do you know you should respond to the distress that's coming, just like poor people respond to their distress? Okay, think about this. How do the poor people respond to distress? It says they cry out. They cry out to the Lord God of Sabaoth, the God of armies. They're crying out to him. He says, you should weep and howl. In other words, your loss is going to be so profound and so terrible that you need to now treat your life as if you were impoverished. Because the miseries, he says, is coming to you. And why? Because they put their trust in the things that perish. You see here, verse 2, your riches are corrupted. Your garments have been eaten by moths. Your gold and silver, it's all of it rusting. And the rust of those things is like a testimony against you. And you will even have your flesh eaten or rusted as if it were fire. So let's talk about that. What is he saying? Well, the rich, proud fools put their trust in things that are diminishing. The wealth itself is corrupted. Moths, bugs have come and they're eating the clothes that you wear. And even your gold and silver, it's tarnishing, it's cankered, it's rusting. And you recognize the language James is using here? Where is he borrowing this entire line of reasoning? Do you remember? It's in actually the Gospels. Can you think about this? There's an echo here of something being said from the Gospels. Remember what Jesus said? Don't lay up your treasures on earth. Why? Because of this right here. This is the problem with these people. You see, the problem, I would say, as a culture that we have in our country is that every person in our culture wants to be rich, but not rich toward God. And I actually have no problem with people having money. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I don't think God thinks it's a bad thing at all. But the problem we have is when people want money, but they don't want God. And they're putting all of their confidence, all of their trust in their possessions. And let me tell you, it's so easy for God to pull the rug right out from underneath you. This almost happened to our family this week. I won't go into it, the details. but we had a person who tried to steal all of our retirement funds from us. They were trying to scam us, and they actually came pretty close. These people are really good. And when praise God, we can say, it's okay, it's in the Lord's hands. But God can take away everything you have in a moment. So you can't put your trust in those things. You can't lay up your treasures there. And we'll talk about what we do with treasures later on. But the richer said, stop and think about what you're doing. If you're putting your trust there, you're about to lose all of that. You see what he says? What's worse than trusting in money? He then goes further. It's being guilty before God. That's the problem with these people. Not only, I would say, do we live in a culture where people are trusting their money, they are unaware or do not care that they live lives in which they are guilty before God. But this is point number two. Point number one, America, you cannot trust your money. Point number two, America, you are guilty before God. And there are three charges that he makes here. Charge one, guilty. You are guilty of cheating other people. You have heaped treasure, the middle of verse 3, together for the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers, who reaped down your fields. They worked in your fields. You kept back from them by fraud. They have cried to me. And they which have reaped, their cries are now in my ears, God says. So the first charge that he makes is stealing. They were actually taking advantage of the poor in order to make themselves richer. Now, there's nothing here that James is writing that goes against the concept of saving or investing. In fact, I think there's a lot in the Bible that talks about saving and investing as being a very good thing. And I really like something that John Piper said a number of years ago. He said, even if you save your salary one day, you're still saving. He goes, the only way you're not saving is if you take your salary, you go and cash your check, you go and then spend every penny of it immediately. That's the only way you're not saving. Because even if you spend it over 2 days, you had to save some of it to the next day. So I thought that was a very interesting argument, and I think he's actually right there. This isn't against investing and saving, it's against hoarding. People have needs, but what's happening here is there's a refusal to help anyone in order to have more money. I want more money for myself, less money for you, so I'm going to hoard my wealth. And so what ended up happening is they were cheating those people to whom they owed money. They were being fraudulent toward them. And it was causing these people to cry out to God. And he says, I've heard their prayers. And that's probably the worst thing that these people could actually hear from God. God is listening to them. He hears their cries. So that's charge number one. You've cheated people. Number two, this is the second charge. You are guilty of living well at the expense of others. He kind of building off of that first charge. And he says in verse 5, you've lived in pleasure on the earth and have been wanton. You've nourished your hearts as in the day of slaughter. They were living for themselves because they wanted personal pleasure. They were self-indulgent and they loved luxury. Do you know, I honestly believe this. One of the blessings I've had growing up in a family like I did, we did not have a lot of money. One of the blessings of growing up in that home is that I learned that I can make do with nearly anything. It's really okay. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to drink spoiled milk. I'm not to that level. I have loved ones who are to that level. I won't go further than that. I have a story I would tell you right here, but it might be embarrassing to some in the room, so I won't say it. But I've learned to make do. And then I got in the military, and boy, you learn to make do. You know, you live. But I've also know what it means to not have to make do. And I think there are a lot of people who, because they're so pursuing luxury, they don't even know what it's like. They actually weep and sorrow because their monies are cankered, they are rusting, and they're losing things, and then they don't know how to react. I had a guy call me once on the phone, and he was calling. He said, "Pastor, I'm in big trouble." I said, "Well, what's wrong, friend?" He said, I was just cheated out of," and he gave me a number. And I thought to myself, I will never have that much money my entire life. It was a lot. It was a huge number. This guy had been swindled. We're talking legal action, people going to jail. It was really bad. But then as I'm trying to talk to him, I said, but you have a nice house, you have a nice car, you have a nice family, you're able to provide for you. I'm going through all the things God has provided that are still there. But I know, Pastor, I know that's true, but I can't get past this. I've lost all this money. What am I going to do? And again, I'm having trouble feeling sorry for you because it's a number I just don't even comprehend. Well, it's hard, but even when you have money, even when you are well-to-do, the attitude we should have is one of a poor person, of a humble person. And the third charge is you have perverted justice to enrich yourselves. So these people, they were living on the backs of the poor and gorging themselves like at the feast after a battle is over, after they're gaining all the spoil. They're living that way. Now he says, you've perverted justice. And this immediately comes to mind is Jezebel and Ahab and what they did to Naboth and his vineyard. They perverted justice in order to steal his vineyard, and they condemned him and killed him, and he was incapable of resisting. I think that's what the last phrase means here. So even they twist justice to get what they want by harming other people, to deprive their neighbors of what they need, who are unable to retaliate, unable to defend themselves so they can take for themselves. So I say, America, your money will not save you, and I say that you are guilty before God. Now, how do we respond to this? Because before I stood up to preach this evening, I was thinking, okay, so this morning I was talking about morality, and today I'm talking about money. You just couldn't pick a Sunday with two worse topics, could you? We're going to take an offering at the end, by the way. I just thought, I just could not have planned. I did not plan this. This is the Lord's doing. But I did come up with 3 ideas that I think will be helpful for you. 3 ideas in application from this. I think we who are wealthy, and because, as I said, we're all wealthy in some way, we must recognize that with our wealth comes responsibility. And there are 3 areas of responsibility that I think we can actually just stop and say, we need to be responsible. Number 1, we should be honest in our financial dealings. That is, anytime we're talking about money, we're talking about property, we need to be upfront honest to a fault. You remember what Solomon wrote in the Proverbs about the guy who swears to his own hurt? To a fault, we need to be honest in our dealings. We shouldn't cheat other people. We shouldn't extort money from other people. We shouldn't evade our taxes. As confiscatory as it seems they are sometimes, we shouldn't swindle people out of their money. I heard about a church in South Carolina. They had a builder in their church, and this guy was just putting lots of money in the offering plate. And one Sunday, the pastor came to his attention that this guy had built an entire subdivision in that town. He was the builder. He had built the whole subdivision. And they had promised everybody when they built the subdivision that they were going to build a clubhouse and a swimming pool. But when he got to the end, he decided, I'll make more money if I pay a little fine to the town for not doing what I told everybody I was going to do instead of building the clubhouse and the swimming pool. So he decided, I'm not going to do that. And all these people who bought houses from him who said, you promised us you would do this. He said, well, I'm going to pay a little fine to the town, and I'm really sorry. I'm not going to do that. It's going to save me a great deal of money. He didn't explain it that way, I'm sure, but that's what he did. So you know what the pastor did? He turned to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. He went down through those list of verses, and he got to the part of extortion and swindling, and he said, this is a church discipline issue, and he kicked the guy out of the church. Well, good on him. Good on him. That's pretty incredible. You're one of your biggest givers because the guy is living like an unbeliever. We have to be honest in our financial dealings. Number 2, we need to be thoughtful about our financial future. So I do think we should save money. And I think it's imperative that we save money because a day is going to come where we may need that money for our lives. And while the church bears some responsibility to help people who are in need, let's not be intentionally needy at the end, right? Let's not say at the end, well, you know, I spent all the funds that God gave me that I could have used for savings. I decided to take all these vacations and do all this stuff, and I didn't really prepare for the future. I didn't go to the ant like the sluggard should and consider her ways and be wise. Instead, what I did was I lived like everybody else, and I enjoyed everything, and now at the end I don't have anything. In church, you need to help me. That's not helpful. And then number 3, and this is probably going to be the most controversial statement of the whole sermon, and it's okay. And if you disagree with me, this is where I would say, it's okay, disagree away, and I will not argue with you. You want to hold a different opinion than I hold, then fine. But I think we should be careful what we buy and spend and where we buy and spend it. Here's what I'm saying by that. Some of the things we purchase here in the United States are being manufactured at the expense of other people. There are people in this world who are still in slavery, who are producing items that are being purchased by American corporations and sold to you. I won't mention the companies, but go type into Google slavery and American companies and see what happens. You might find your favorite tennis shoe is on that list. You might find your favorite t-shirt is there on that list. I'm not going to tell you you have to do it, but I think it would be wise. And this isn't a Buy America speech, okay? But I have come to the place where I'm saying I want to be careful at what I buy, because when I was a boy, you could buy a pair of duck head pants manufactured in the United States. It had a little head of a duck on the back, and they were about $20. I didn't realize this, but during the Clinton administration, we had a free trade agreement called NAFTA with Mexico and Canada, and then he made some agreements with Asian countries, and it flooded our markets with cheap goods through a company called Walmart. And all of a sudden, you can buy pants for like $8. What nirvana is this? This is wonderful. I don't have to spend $25, $30, $40 for a pair of pants that every time I throw them in the washing machine wrinkle up and look like an old Kleenex. I can actually buy a nice pair of pants that don't wrinkle, and they cost a fraction of what I used to spend. Well, I guess this is what I'm saying, is that some of these products are produced by people who earn very low wages. Very low wages. You would never do this work. You would never want your children to do this work. You would never want your parents to do this work. But sometimes in America, we benefit from people who do this. I want you to know that slave labor was outlawed in 2016 in terms of companies bringing those products to market. But as of 2018, it was still happening in abundance, and it may still be the case today in these companies. So I would say, be careful where you spend your money. Be wise about it. Think about where it's manufactured if you can. And then finally, don't pursue wealth for wealth's sake. Money is not lasting. Don't put your trust there. Don't put your confidence there. Trust in the Lord. Put all of your faith and confidence and trust in Him. And the Lord will help you. He will bring you to a place of stability in your life that even if you don't have as much money as your neighbor, that's okay. If you stop watching television and worry about what everybody else has, and you just focus in on what God has provided for you and be thankful for that, you'll be blessed beyond measure.